My understanding of the concept of Holodomor is that it is a legal historical concept. Well, I am a demographer sociologist. So given the area of research of demography, demography does not have the elements to have a valid response to that question. Now, on the personal level, given all the research I have done on the Holodomor, and I will show some of the facts, I am convinced that it was genocide according to my kind of intuitive concept of what Holodomor is. More than 30 demographers and historians from at least 6 countries all over the world have tried to investigate this question. And with one exception, I would say the 99% of all the estimates fluctuate between 3.5 and 5 million extra death caused by the famine in Ukraine. That's the first part. But what is probably not widely known, that out of these, well, I've been working on this topic for the last 5 years with a group of demographers in Kyiv at the Institute of Demography, and also with some historians, both in the United States and in Ukraine. So our estimate is about 4 million excess deaths caused by the Holodomor. And then there is more than 500,000 of lost births, but that's another topic. So within, and we also documented that there was famine also in 34. So we consider the period 32 to 34 as the period of the Holodomor. Out of these 4 million, 90% occurred in 1 year, in 33. And within those 3.5 million, more than 80% occurred in the first 6-7 months of 33 rural deaths. In other words, there was an explosion of mortality in the first half of 1933 in rural areas of Ukraine. And that is almost a unique characteristic of any other man-made famine I know of that makes the Holodomor different, special, compared to other man-made famines. And this has been pointed out some years ago by the French historian Alain Blum in his famous book, Birth, Life, and Death in the Soviet Union. And I quote, "Rarely in all the demographic history of Europe, a famine caused losses of such proportion." And he underlines the word all, the famines that he knows in the history of Europe. And this part of the Holodomor is extremely important for the argument for the genocide. According to our estimates, about 250,000 of people died in 1932 in Ukraine because of the famine. And we have plenty of official documents that was hunger all over the country. People were dying. And they were asking Moscow to lower the quota of grain procurement and provide some help for people that were dying of hunger. But all of a sudden, starting in January, we have this massive explosion, and out of the 4 million, 3.5 happened basically in 6 months. What are the reasons? First, this was picked up by the Italian historian Andrea Graziosi, and then elaborated by the Ukrainian historian Sviatoslav Kulczycki, that they divide the famine in Ukraine in 2 parts. 32 was a generalized famine, basically, because of collectivization, problems, implementation, etc. And it was wild in many parts of the Soviet Union. while in 33, it was not famine, it was genocide, because something special, different happened that caused this surge in mortality. So Kulczycki's explanation is that there were two main causes of this surge. Number one, that because Ukraine was not able to fulfill the quota for 32, there was pressure to try to fulfill the quota. They came up with this fantasy of cities of grain hidden by the peasants, stealing from the state. So there was a massive campaign of searches in households all over the country to try to find the hidden stolen grain in people's houses and in some collective farms. And we have thousands of testimonies that in many cases, when they came to the house, if they found grain, they did not only take the grain, but took all the food. So basically you had thousands of rural households in Ukraine left without food. The second argument that Kulczycki makes is that many peasants traveled to Russia from Ukraine in search of food, took the embroideries, their gold to try to bargain for food and bring it back home. So there were many thousands that started traveling to Ukraine, and finally the communist authorities in these Russian regions say, we have a problem. All these people coming, causing disturbances, etc. So Stalin gave the order in January 22nd to close the border, and most of these peasants were returned to the village. Also, they instituted controls of movement of peasants in Ukraine. It was very difficult to leave your village and go to a big city like Kyiv and Kharkiv, try to food there. So basically, the peasants were prisoners in their villages and were condemned to a slow death. So these two factors conversed and multiplied the number of deaths, and that is the cause of the sudden increase. I made a detailed analysis of the timing of these events, and I show in one of my papers that these two factors can explain this increase up to at most early April. After that, that explanation is not valid anymore to justify the further increase in death we saw until June, because the official campaign of searches for grain was finished sometime in February. By law, no more campaign of grain and also seed grain. So the searches stopped sometime in February, let's say end of February. Now, let's assume that these people, all the food was taken away. They could not travel outside the village to look for food. They were trapped in their village. Medical evidence shows us that people can survive without food at most a month. So all these families that were out of food, in theory, should have been dead at most at the end of March. So the effect of the taking away all the food stopped at that time in terms of increasing death. We still had the effect they could not travel. But all the indications are that the number of peasants that traveled was in the tens of thousands. But we are talking about here about at least 3 million extra deaths in these 6 months. So that is not enough to justify this tremendous increase. I'm suggesting two more factors that may be responsible for this continuous increase in death. Number one, in Ukraine, there were two funds. One was a seed fund, seed for the next harvest, and there was an emergency fund, special for emergency situations. By decree of the Soviet government, those two funds were depleted as part of the quota for the grain procurement. So those two funds that were supposed to be there were zero. They were taken over for the quota. And on top of that, the grain that was distributed to the peasants in the collective farms for the work, if the collective farm did not fulfill the quota, they had to return that grain to the state. So when the crisis became very acute, let's say in April, if they had these reserve funds, they could have used them to help people survive until June, when the new harvest came. But that grain was not available. That's the first factor. The second factor is that during the whole year of 1933, Stalin had a drastic purge of the Communist Party and all the government officials at all levels, both in Ukraine and in Northern Caucasus, and especially Kuban. During that year, about 70% of all the rayon and village officials were replaced. And in many cases, the people that were kicked out or shot were Ukrainian communists. They were replaced by Russian communists. So that, and we have documents that these people instituted a much harsher repression against the Ukrainian peasants. So my hypothesis is that all these changes also contributed to an increase in death during that period. But so far, the effect of that purge has not been studied on the amount of death caused by the famine. So we still do not have a good explanation of the totality of the surge. But the fact is that we have this specific situation that cannot be attributed to unintended consequences of a collectivization policy. This unique explosion of mortality was caused by political factors, not economic factors, which basically jives with the genocide argument. So that's point number one. Point number two, just to illustrate the first point, if you look at the increases in excess deaths between January and June of 1933, as you can see, the increase for all of Ukraine was 10 times. In almost like Kharkiv and Kyiv, 14, 15 times. In other words, the number of excess deaths increased 15 times between January and June of 1933, while in all of Russia, it was only 3 times, and only in Saratov Oblast and to some degree Krasnodar Krai, which we'll talk about in a minute, the increase was somewhat high, but much lower than in Ukraine. So now we go to the comparison with Russia. First, all of Ukraine was affected by the famine, all the oblasts, although there were some differences. While in Russia, only certain areas of the country were affected by. These were the grain growing areas. The other parts of the country were very little affected. So overall, our estimate is that the excess deaths in Ukraine are equivalent to 13% of the total population, while the excess deaths in Russia close to 3% of the whole population. Now, and we see big differences in level of death in the Russian regions versus Ukraine Oblast, and also in the slope of the growth of the mortality in 1933. So we classify the regions by speed of increase, high, moderate, and low. We see all the oblasts in Ukraine except Chernihiv are in the high category. And in Russia, we have two regions, Krasnodar and Saratov, high. We have a couple of moderate, and then most of the Russian regions are in the low speed of increase of mortality in 33. And we have analyzed factors that are related to this speed of increase. We have, as we saw, closing of the borders between Russia and Ukraine, food confiscation during searches, and I am adding to that the seed and emergency grain funds depleted. And also we have estimated the level of resistance and repression of that resistance in the different regions. And we can see that for the regions with high level of increase, you have a perfect correlation with these four factors. While with regions with low level of increase, like lower Volga, Central Black Earth, there's practically no correlation with these factors. So we can deduce that this high increase in mortality was caused by these factors that were not present in these Russian regions. Now, these Russian regions also had some increase, but very low. And the explanation for that very low is we have seen in other famines caused by climate change, like in Asia and African countries, that it's been documented that when the famine starts, up to a certain time, you have an increasing pool of the population that gets debilitated. And it comes to a point where all of a sudden they start dying at a very fast rate for some time until it reaches a peak, and then it stops and it goes down. So the explanation of this small increase in these Russian regions is basically physiological, not political. While these factors that we have shown that are connected to this high increase are of political nature. So the Australian economist historians, Whitcroft, has coined two names for the two perspectives of the famine, because there are basically two interpretations of the famine, 1932, 33, 34. One is so he calls man-made by accident. And the second one he calls man-made on purpose. And it's the second interpretation that is the one that is the foundation for the genocide argument. And our demographic analysis provides a quantitative elements that support the second interpretation. So I argue that that is the demographer's contribution to the argument of genocide.